There's been a lot of news. I think Josh reported on it on Monday. Donald Trump has announced that there will be a 90-day pause to all US aid, save for one or two exceptions. And a lot of information has been coming out about where US aid was going globally and how much the US deep state, because US aid was heavily tied into the CIA as well, absolutely hates you, the American tax-paying citizen, and how eager they are to waste your money. So for just a reminder of the kinds of things... Can this mouse work? There we go. Of the kinds of things that was being spent using your taxpayer money. $15 million for condoms to the Taliban. Almost $500,000 to promote atheism in Nepal through the State Department.
Why does the US government hate Buddhism?
Yeah, what is in America's global interests that Nepal is atheist?
Also,
Unless, of course, it's just a program run by insane race communists.
all those Buddhist extremists sat up in mountains minding their own business. How dare they?
Yeah, 20 grand for a drag show in Ecuador, almost 50 grand for a transgender opera in Colombia, 32 grand for a trans-centered comic book in Peru. So it seems that this was mainly being... What's this? $3,300,000 for being gay in the Caribbean.
So this is like alphabet people colonialism, basically.
It really is. It seems to have been a primary goal of the US State Department, the CIA, and USAID to promote insane leftist causes globally. I can only assume to destabilize the cultures of these countries for some nefarious purpose.
Well, the way a lot of these things work is that they create all these organizations in a host country, and then they use it as a bargaining chip. Basically, you give us what we want, or we cause instability in your country. So sometimes it can get to the point where they cause street riots from these set up organizations like this.
Yeah, AstroTurf protests.
And then all of a sudden the protests just evaporate when the US gets what it wants.
It's very interesting. I mean, the US has used these kinds of global development of democracy goals to hold countries for ransom for decades at this point.
To be clear, the US government. I'm not making the US people complicit in this.
Trust me, we're well aware that none of you watching this voted for $14 million worth of cash vouchers to be given to migrants at the southern border. We know that's nothing, not even leftist Democrats have voted specifically for that through these programs.
It does read like something from Brewster's Millions, where it's just trying to spend as much money as possible on as little as possible. I don't know if you've ever seen that film. From the 80s,
haven't.
But showing my age a bit there. But he has to burn through $30 million in 30 days and have nothing to show for it at the end. That's his...
Okay, so he has to give $1.5 million for job opportunities for gays in Serbia.
Yep, that's it. That's in Brewster's Millions, yep.
He could burn through that just funding the NHS for a minute.
Yeah.
There you go.
Well, a couple of minutes at least. Come on.
Maybe not even that.
Yeah, well, maybe not even that. But since this came out on Monday and since we reported on it, a lot more has come out. So, for instance, Carolyn Levitt just was speaking about how also found in all of the USAID funding, there was $2 million for sex changes in Guatemala, $6 million to fund tourism in Egypt.
Wait, what?
How's that even in the interests of the US whatsoever? Even any political faction.
Maybe on behalf of Israel to attract Palestinian tourists to Egypt, at which point they don't get let back in.
They shut the door to the pyramid and they're just stuck there.
With all the mummies. Oh no.
So how do you promote in Egypt of all places? It's like
they don't really need the promotion.
Right, yeah.
$20 million on a Sesame Street show in Iraq.
$20 million is a vast sum of money. We're used to, aren't we, the idea of, we hear the word millions get thrown around or billions get thrown around, but the real reality is that $20 million is a vast sum of money. Absolutely crazy. If you saw 20 million in cash, it would be a huge volume, right?
I feel like someone needs to give me a visual demonstration, and that would best work by showing it in my bank vault.
It'd be like that bit in Breaking Bad where they open up the garage and it's all full of money. And I think that was only like $70 million or something, and it almost filled an entire storage unit.
Does Iraq want a
Sesame Street?
Wasn't Sesame Street, if I recall from childhood, it was very, very specifically tied to New York often, wasn't it? It was a very American thing. It was a New York...
Well, that's why they need
thing.
all of that money so they can develop it for a foreign
So
culture.
Would it be set in Baghdad? Sesame Street, but set in Baghdad with Arabic-speaking puppets? Or... actually, I don't care. I don't care.
female,
Bomb to bomb.
all the female puppets will be in, the niqabs.
No, there won't be female puppets, no. That'd be,
all right,
that'd be
They're all
haram.
male.
That would be haram. And also 4.5 million to combat disinformation in Kazakhstan, of all places. So again, the question becomes, how does this benefit not the American state, because the American state loves to cause all sorts of discord across the world, but the American people themselves, how does this benefit them as a nation to take their money and just do this with it? It doesn't. Obviously, it doesn't. It's deep state, global agendas that they want to promote across the place, like you say, as a bargaining chip. Also, just because of the fact that American deep state does seem to be somewhat wedded to this kind of insane ideology and promoting it globally. Because, of course, as we know, the empires love to spread belief systems across the world, especially when America is going for a kind of global domination there. But in support of this sort of stuff, you do need a propaganda arm. And what works better for propaganda than bought and paid for media, both domestic and international? So one of the more interesting things that came out about this was that the BBC's Media Action Charity was receiving £2.6 million from US aid. And this was interesting because it's not the BBC itself, it's their Media Action Charity, which works to train international journalists to be able to spread democracy and free thought across the world. They actually made a statement about it saying that a free press is essential to freedom and democracy. Very ironic coming from an arm of the BBC.
Yeah, they're not free. They're state-owned.
Yeah, and 75% of countries around the world do not have a free press. BBC Media Action supports local media around the world to deliver trusted information to people most in need. Because what this really means is we want to make sure that we can train up insane lefty communist journalists to subvert their home nations.
Yeah, it reads like a sort of insurgency, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's what it is. It's an international fifth column set up and manned by insane communist journalists in every country that they go to. That's what they want to make sure that there is, so that you can spread discord. And happily, it turns out US aid was about 8% of their income from 2023 to 2024. So that's actually a huge bit of their budget. 8%. If you have to make up an 8% hole in your budget, you're going to have to cut a lot of stuff. But they want to make sure that, that we're only an international charity. We're completely separate from BBC News. We're wholly reliant on our donors. No, I hope you get shut down. I hope you get shut down. I don't think the BBC or the West in general should be involved in this kind of subversive action internationally, unless it actually serves our interests across the globe, which these kinds of things typically don't. But
I'm going to need to hear Mariana Spring's take on this. I can't trust you as fake news.
Right, of course.
Or I can't trust Action Media. I need specifically her take on it in order to know what's real on this.
We'll let you know.
If every single journalist left the country overnight, I would wake up tomorrow to a better country.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the whole argument is nonsense.
Oh, it absolutely is. And one of the interesting things that came out about the domestic side of this as well is that Carolyn Levitt announced that Doge is cutting all funding to Politico and other media outlets. Now, people like Benny Johnson are saying explicitly that it's funded by USAID. It's not quite that simple, but we'll go into it in a moment. Basically to say, though, that from all of the government itself, Politico was receiving about $8.2 million last year.
Which is not a small amount of money for a media company, is it?
No, and as soon as this became clear to everybody, coincidentally, at the exact same time, all of a sudden, nobody got paid at Politico.
What a coincidence.
Interesting coincidence. Now, they say that it's due to some kind of glitch on the payroll side, but it is interesting that this immediately happened, and it's especially interesting that Politico was getting money from the government when they'd also been promoting things like the Hunter Biden story being Russian disinformation, because Politico are a leftist rag. Now, of course, it may be a bit premature to be able to say that this is going to take them down, because according to this graph that he shows here, it seems that their money only really came in from the government, the $8.2 million in the past year or so. So they probably have other ways of actually funding themselves. It's just funny if it does turn out that they really had been so short-sighted that they got $8 million from the government and said, fantastic, we can just use that to pay all of our staff now. We don't need to worry about any, contingencies. That would be quite funny.
I think that what probably is going on is that they're telling their staff that they can't pay them because they're going for a period of creative accounting to account for the shortfall. And basically that's something that they can push into the distance ever so slightly, and it gives them more time to sort of make up the losses.
Yeah, but this also raises the question, okay, Politico's getting $8 million from the US government to spread terrible leftist reporting. What other news organizations are also receiving money? And the website this is on, usaspending.gov, you can try and track some of this, so please feel free to take a look yourself. But I find it interesting that other news sites have immediately gone into damage control with this, like this Axios article talking about how, well, actually, if you look into it, it's not just USAID. USAID only gave about $24,000 of the $8.2 million that they were giving to Politico. The rest of the money seems to have come from the rest of the government and likely the cost of premium subscriptions, such as Politico Pro. And
a lot of subscriptions.
No, it is. And I found there's better and more information found in this Daily Mail article here saying that Politico actually received about $44,000 from USAID last year. Still, even if it's only $44,000, why should a US international aid program be giving money to domestic news sites anyway? Very interesting, but was given millions more from other federal agencies, according to public records. Most notably, the Department of Health and Human Services had $1.37 million in obligations. The Department of the Interior and the Department of Energy were also among the top spenders. It's understood that most of the agency's spending is on Politico's B2B service, Politico Pro, which offers, quote, non-partisan, real-time intelligence personalized to their area of policy focus, unquote, according to the platform. Subscriptions to this can cost around...
What does that mean, exactly?
I assume real-time intelligence personalized to their area of policy focus. It just gives them news that's related to their job. Okay. Subscriptions to this can cost around $10,000 per year.
Oh. Okay. Sounds legit.
So the government would have had to make up that, shell out for more than 800 accounts, according to this article. So that's all very interesting. So the US government was paying for subscriptions to Politico to ensure that its own staff members were getting non-partisan information from Politico, who are absolutely a non-partisan organization. And you can tell that because they released lots of agit slop talking about things like Gamergate from a totally non-partisan, non-leftist perspective, and they had lots and lots and lots of articles that were being funded, we know now, at least to the tune of about $8 million as of last year, but we don't know anymore, about every single time something's talking about MAGA, they bring up Gamergate, Gamergate this, Pizzagate, Gamergate, and everything to do with right-wing reporting. They need you to know that, yes, it all still ties back to Gamergate, because Politico are a non-partisan, non-biased organization that do not have a deep leftist bias in their bones, all right? All right, we've got that clear, right? And the US government agencies just needed to make sure they were getting their information from this particular news site, okay?
There's a lot of mentions of Gamergate for things that don't even seem in any way related either.
Yeah, Inauguration Day, Trump takes office, 2017. For some reason, we're just going to talk about Gamergate in there. Okay, all right, that's...
Brianna Wu as well, which is funny.
Yeah, oh god, it was from Brianna Wu. Okay, but Politico themselves, unlike the BBC, I've looked on their website, so far they do not have a statement about what has come up, but there was this article which spoke about... about how terrible it was that US aid is being gutted the way that it is, how we need to take this pause off and we need to carry on because it's all in the benefit of the US international image. Now, there is something to worry about here because they do report that Secretary of State Marco Rubio is now the acting director of US aid, and the administration is reportedly trying to fold the agency into the State Department. More on that in a moment. But they also say things like Andrew Natsios, which is a very interesting surname.
Got to make sure to pronounce that one correctly, don't you?
Yeah, who ran USAID under President George W. Bush and is a lifelong conservative Republican, calls such moves illegal and outrageous. What Musk and Rubio are doing is criminal. They can't abolish an aid program without a vote of Congress. Moreover, he says, they missed the point that USAID is critical to winning the competition with China and reflects long-standing Republican priorities. That's just the go-to talking point now if you ever want to justify anything that's against the interests of the American people. Well, don't you want to beat China? You need those H-1B visas, or else you're not going to be able to beat China. Don't you need to be giving money so that people in Guatemala can get sex changes? If you don't do it, then China's going to do it, and China's going to win.
And also, the US has already beaten China in many different metrics. That they're already in the position of dominance. What they should be doing is just focusing on growing and being better, not let's try and beat this country that has a massively lower GDP per capita than us.
Listen, Josh, buddy, I think you're missing the point that if you don't spend $20 million on a Sesame Street show in Iraq, then China might do the same thing, which means that they win.
I'm very curious to see what that show's like, to be fair.
I mean, well, it's probably not going to happen now, is it?
I did a bit of content a few months ago, and I think it was now, on the podcast with Dan, talking about the Great Wurlitzer, and I've written an article on a similar topic before. Don't know if any of you are aware of that, but yeah, the way that, going back decades, as you already mentioned, well, there's a great book called... I also did Brokenomics.
Confessions of an Economic Assassin or
Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Yeah, I did a Brokenomics with Dan on that, where going back for decades, that's the plan, that's the strategy, is that the carrot is the massive loans. You have to take out massive loans, essentially with America or the World Bank, in order to build quote unquote infrastructure. And if you don't, ultimately they'll send in CIA kill teams. And then ultimately, aircraft carriers and the Marines. In other words, you've just got to do as you're told, ultimately.
And this is just a new way of doing
become a vassal of the United States in various ways, or of the State Department, or of Langley, or whatever it is.
Yeah, if you don't do what we say, we're going to send in the Sesame Street show to turn your children gay. There's
more than one way to skin a cat, and it's evolved over the years. To the point where now that USAID, or the Department for International Development, is actually some sort of cutout for the intelligence services or for interests in the State Department, whatever it is. We don't really get to know what their agenda is, or really who they are particularly. But yeah, it's all just smoke and mirrors for some sort of agenda that we don't really know properly.
Other than it's subversive and degenerate, for the most part.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem to be in the interests of the United States, certainly not the individual taxpayers.
Well, apparently if the US was making sure to spend $8 million to make sure that loads of its staff in, like, the Department of the Interior can make sure that they get all of their news from Politico, I guess it starts to make a bit of sense how it is that the people staffing those departments have the views that they do, right? It feels like it's a cycle that it's like a Ouroboros, the snake eating itself.
I mentioned the idea of a Wurlitzer. That goes back to Frank Wisner, a very early CIA operative. A Wurlitzer is just a very old-fashioned word for a jukebox, basically. But the way that the intelligence services play the tune through the media, through so-called legit mainstream media, corporate mainstream media, they get them to play the tune, and everyone, the rest of the world, just have to dance to it. Well, the modern day, the 2024, 2025 equivalent of that is something like Politico and its funding and its obvious bent. Well, now it looks like hopefully that under Trump, they're starting to, on some level, claw that back. reverse the tide on some level, co-opting Rubio to do it.
Well,
although
perhaps because
he's changed his tune in recent times, hasn't he?
Well, that's the
Is
thing.
that not what you're about to say?
Yeah, I'm a little bit worried seeing that he's in charge of USAID now, and they're apparently trying to wrap it back around into the State Department, which is that he's flip-flopped on this a lot and has said in the past many times over how important the foreign aid was. In 2022, he tried to argue to Biden to increase the budget for USAID.
In 2022?
Yeah, very recently.
Huh.
So it seems very opportunist now that he's suddenly taken the opposite tact, and he has said that once the pause is done, they are going to continue with foreign aid initiatives, but, quote unquote, only if they actually benefit US and international interests. But again, I don't trust that Rubio or the State Department are really going to take that much of a different tact with this, because from the perspective of carrot and stick, as you've mentioned, well, yeah, maybe you could make the argument that this is in the US states' global interests and the goals that they're going for, that being complete total domination and hegemony. So I would say don't necessarily declare victory yet, because we'll see what happens after this pause is done and see how people like Rubio take this. I know that Musk and others want to completely gut this, but he's not the only one who makes those decisions.
I mean, there is the whole world of soft power, right? And for anyone who might not know, or anyone, our British audience, the State Department is the American equivalent of the Foreign Office or the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, you know, to do with all things foreign affairs related. So some people might not know that. It's not obvious from the word, is it? The State Department. Anyway,
it's making sure that America stays number one.
It's like going back decades, going after the war, World War II, like the Marshall Plan, for example, where they were genuinely trying to sort of stabilise the world that had been ruined by World War II in all sorts of ways. And we're now, decades and decades later, or 80 years later or whatever it is, it's now been just completely subverted and perverted, where they're trying to set up Sesame Street in Iraq, right? It's a million miles away from the Marshall Plan, where, you know, just giving completely impoverished Greek people some donkeys so they can live, right?
Stelios is very grateful.
We'll see what
in exchange
Rubio,
for military base,
what the State Department does.
Europe.
But I would say that the State Department is one of the cabals in the world, which I just absolutely don't trust. Like the CCP, like the Communist Party, like the FSB or the GRU. There's quite a few cabals in the world where I don't trust them.
Oh, and I
don't trust them.
You shouldn't trust any government.
And if you're an American citizen, I think it's perfectly fair not to trust them either, because the State Department's very eager to send your children off to war for no reason.
Well, they do seem to be responsible for, because so many things come under the purview of the State Department, right? So many things. Giant budgets all over the place.
They were run by Janet Yellen for a while.
Yellen was at the Treasury.
Treasury. Sorry, yeah, got that mixed up.
Janet the Felon Yellen. I wrote an article called that. Running
money printer as well, wouldn't she?
Yeah, running the deficit into skyrocket numbers. But yeah, we'll see. Rubio does seem to have changed his tune then recently. I guess he knows the way the wind's blowing. His master is Trump. And if that's what the Donald wants, then I guess he's got to do it.
Again, I think it's I'm eager for things to improve, but I want to be not so hasty before we declare absolute and total victory with these sorts of things, because basically putting it in the hands of a neocon is not necessarily my idea of a victory. But going back to the journalistic side of this as well, as I mentioned, a lot of this is promoted not just by setting up Sesame Street in Iraq, but US international aims are also set up through journalism internationally as well as domestic, and there's a lot coming out about the kind of international journalism that's going to be hit by the US aid freeze. Now, according to... Oh, go on.
I was just going to say, don't threaten us with a good time.
Yeah. So according to Reporters Without Borders, globalist organization, the aid freeze appears to have put a hold on $268 million that was earmarked to fund independent media and the free flow of information. Nice, unbiased information.
Well, I don't remember our USAID funding. We've not got any of that. So we're an independent media organisation. Where was the USAID's, line to us exactly.
Yeah, did we get any? Did New Culture Forum get any? Did anyone on the right anywhere get any?
It always seems to be very heavily biased towards left-wing organisations, doesn't it? But it says in the recent past, US aid had boasted of supporting more than 6,000 journalists, around 700 independent newsrooms, and nearly 300 media-focused civil society groups in 30 or so countries, and yet Reporters Without Borders notes the full impact of the freeze is hard to measure, since many recipients are hesitant to draw attention for fear of risking long-term funding or coming under political attacks. News outlets that have been exiled from Iran and Belarus did tell the organisation, under the cover of anonymity, that the freeze has forced them to take drastic measures just to survive, while Cameroon, an investigative site, said that it had to suspend projects linked to journalist safety in upcoming elections in the country. I would assume they mean Iran there. Reporters Without Borders also noted the harsh effect on journalism in Ukraine, where, and this is the real figure, 90% of news organizations in Ukraine rely on US aid funding, some very heavily. Writing last week, Olga Rudenko, the editor-in-chief of the Kiev Independent, which has received US aid grants in the past, claimed that the freeze has caused harm to independent Ukrainian journalism on par with the COVID-19 pandemic and the onset of Russia's war, and could soon surpass both in severity, if not reversed. So almost the entirety of Ukrainian journalism is a State Department op.
Put down your pen, get in the trenches. That's what I say.
That's interesting, isn't it? USAID's website has also been offline since Saturday, but a surviving post under the agency's profile on Medium from around a year ago is telling of its approach towards funding journalism overseas. The article states that supporting independent media has been part of USAID's democracy and governance assistance efforts since the 1980s, and that the US government is now the largest public donor to independent media development globally, above a graphic featuring a quote from President Biden describing press freedom as the bedrock of democracy and an outlet for... So basically, they've been using it to fund journalistic propaganda for color revolutions.
And then just calling it independent.
Yeah. That's very interesting.
So they've completely subverted the word independent then.
It's not independent because it's funded by the US government.
Right.
So by definition, it can't be. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and for a little bit more information, there was this interesting Substack. I don't have access to the full thing because it's paid, but all the information that's available for free here is still very telling. This is from Lee Fang's Substack. USAID funded the Zinc Network, an anti-disinformation group that's targeted Max Blumenthal, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Representative Andy Briggs. It funded a pesticide industry public relations effort known as Vfluence, which dug up dirt about American food journalists Michael Pollan and Mark Bittman. Most troublingly, the Foreign Assistance Agency has financed a network of groups in Ukraine that have spread claims that American voices in favor of peace negotiations with Russia are agents of the Kremlin. American government entities face restrictions on spreading this propaganda against domestic targets, so the foreign nexus of US aid provides a convenient loophole. American grants and contracts flow through third-party intermediaries to a network of foreign recipients who can push to silence American journalists and politicians. In Ukraine, USAID, through its contractor Internews, supports a network of social media-focused news outlets, including New Voice of Ukraine, Vox Ukraine, Detector Media, and the Institute of Mass Information. These news outlets have produced a series of videos and reports targeting economist Jeffrey Sachs, commentator Tucker Carlson, journalist Glenn Greenwald, and Professor John Mearsheimer as figures within a controlled network of Russian propaganda. Vox Ukraine also is an official, well, I would assume was at this point, an official fact-checking partner for Meta, and helped the social media giant censor so-called misinformation and disinformation. Detector Media similarly produces English-language disinformation reports widely circulated through the Western media. Despite branding as independent outlets, these organizations are heavily reliant on USAID. They provide special grants to Detector Media to undermine Kremlin information operations and bolster international support for solidarity with Ukraine. In 2021, Detector Media received 35% of its nearly $1 million budget from US aid contractor Internews.
Would I be able to point out something that I don't think anyone's pointed out quite yet? That the sheer extent and scale of these networks, I've seen diagrams of them, and they are massive. And the fact that the Democrats could not only do this using the US government, but then also keep it mostly a secret is quite telling. And I think that people shouldn't necessarily underestimate that ability yet, because, you know, they've not been completely defanged until they've been starved of resources for a long time.
Yeah, Musk actually had to go into the USAID office department and basically do some pretty sneaky moves to even be able to get access to a lot of the information that they've been able to get for the reports that Catherine Levitt has been doing on this.
It seems to me that they go after individual journalists and economists and things you mentioned there. Go after like food journalists, like the way they went after Rorig Nationalist, for example. And so it's like the Ministry of Truth. It is like USAID. It's some sort of funding, some sort of global Ministry of Truth type thing. And if that doesn't work, they'll pass your dossier over to the Ministry of Love, and then you're in real trouble.
Well, you either control...
this is Orwellian stuff. It really is.
Well, you control the flow of information by funding the journalists, and if you have journalists that you don't like, you control the information that's spread around them.
And just call it misinformation, disinformation, the fight against misinformation or disinformation, when in fact that's exactly the thing that you're peddling.
Yeah. And Mike Benz also pointed this one out, which was that...
Yeah, he's good on this stuff, right?
He is very good on this stuff. It was when it came to Rudy Giuliani's reports on Rudy Giuliani that led to Donald Trump's impeachment. It was done by OCCRP's reporting. And if you go to the next one, what can you find here? USAID funding investigative reporting to the tune of $20 million going to OCCRP.
What is the OCCRP?
The Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. So they did investigative reporting around Rudy Giuliani.
The irony of going after Giuliani, considering what he did to the mob. You know, the people reporting on organised crime, and then they're going after him.
Yeah,
the guy
so they
who
do
prosecuted
internationally.
Organised criminals.
He's America's mayor.
They do it.
How dare they go after Rudy?
They target their international enemies through this, and it seems they also target their domestic enemies through this. And there are a whole bunch of bits of legislation that say you're not allowed to do this, so they go, fantastic, we'll use USAID and other dark money schemes to get the money to people who technically aren't the American government, so they can do it for us.
If you would like to watch the full uncut version that is also uncensored, head on over to lotuseaters.com to find out more.